In August of 2013, Antoinette Topps was sitting at the reception desk of the elementary school where she worked near Atlanta, Georgia. She was the bookkeeper for the school, and so she wasn't normally in the reception area, but she happened to be there when a gunman stormed in with an AK-47 and 500 rounds of ammunition. In that moment, the only thing that stood between 800 children and his assault rifle was Antoinette. Thankfully, this story has a happy ending, as Antoinette was able to single-handedly talk the gunman out of his planned rampage. And as you can imagine, when the dust settled from this event, news outlets from around the world came knocking on Antoinette's door, wanting to know how she'd done it. By now, the answer she gave should be very familiar to you. Antoinette said she practiced a technique known as anchoring, where she centered into her core values of kindness and compassion and allowed those values to guide her behavior. I'm sharing Antoinette's story with you because it touches on many of the tools that we've covered in this course so far. Antoinette's anchoring process is similar to the virtues, intentions, and goals process we discussed earlier, and whether Antoinette knew it or not, she was also practicing the 4 questions in the sense that she was aware of what was going on in her mind without allowing fear to take over. She made space for what was happening instead of resisting it, and she was present enough to touch the situation with compassion, which seems counterintuitive in this case, but is ultimately what saved lives that day, including most likely her own. I hope you never encounter anything even remotely similar to what Antoinette experienced, but since none of us get to opt out of challenge in our own ways, her example of mindfulness in action is worthy of consideration and study. Now let me give you a contrasting story from my own career. In 2011, I was scheduled to be interviewed for a live national segment on college to career advice. It was the biggest career break that I'd had up until that point by far, and at a moment where I should have been so happy and so excited, I was very unmindfully drowning in fear because I kept having the same thoughts over and over again. What if I'm asked a question and I don't know the answer? What if I freeze? What if I ramble? What if I don't make any sense? What if I choke? The panic must have been written on my face because as I sat in the studio waiting for the red light to come on, signaling that we were live, I heard a producer very loudly in my ear say, "Breathe, Emily." I got through that interview and it even went well, but I knew in that moment that the way I was thinking needed to change dramatically or I was going to block any opportunity like that from ever happening to me again because I didn't have the container to hold it. 2 stories and 2 different examples of mindful awareness. And while my situation was obviously far less traumatic than Antoinette's, and so it's certainly not an apples to apples comparison, you can see that when we make the inner terrain safe, as Antoinette did so beautifully and I did so poorly, regardless of what's happening outside of us, the effect is what is called presence. So let's drill this down a bit into what having presence actually means, because it's obviously important to your career given how much we like to talk in business about executive presence and leadership presence. A simple definition of presence is the energy that you exude, and regardless of whether your energy is high level or low level, other people can usually pick up on it without you having to say a word. And so just as we use the practice of mindfulness to understand what's going on in our minds so we can better manage our behavior, presence is also something that we can take ownership of as well. Think of it this way. I mentioned before that if you're like most people, you've probably been conditioned to think of success as horizontal reach. How vast is your influence? How many people do you manage? How much money do you make? How many followers do you have? But with more horizontal reach comes more responsibility, meaning more weight on the decisions you make, more resources are involved, and more direct effect of your behavior on the lives of other people. It's important to recognize that the horizontal bar of your career will only go as far as the vertical bar of your inner strength will support it. The taller the building, the stronger the foundation needs to be, and the same principle applies to you. The more success that you achieve or aspire to achieve, the greater your internal foundation will need to be to support you. Otherwise, as I learned in my interview, even if you get the big opportunities, you'll collapse under the weight of them, and often very publicly. And so what I'd like to talk about today is how you can build those foundational muscles the same way that you would build physical muscles so that you can stay anchored in the same presence that Antoinette showed through any circumstance or situation that life throws at you. And the way to do this is by working with your emotions. So for the purposes of this video, I'm going to keep the focus on strong emotions because these are not only the trickiest to navigate, but they're also what can cause the most damage to your reputation and your relationships if you allow them to take over. And what I mean by that is when we're experiencing something like anger or loss, for example, again, it's very easy to fall into our comfortable and somewhat socially supported behavioral patterns of lashing out or shutting down. And these are the things that the 4 questions process and the ladder of inference, which Deborah will introduce to you soon, can certainly help you move through. But there's another strong emotion that I want to cover that I see over and over again in coaching clients, and it's the exact opposite of presence, namely avoidance. When we don't like something about the way we're feeling in the present, as humans we have a tendency to run or numb. And what I mean by that is rather than face the thoughts or feelings we don't like, we have a tendency to run from them, or worse, to sedate them with things like eating junk food or drinking alcohol or shopping, overworking, and other distractions like TV and social media. And so a huge part of the work of mindfulness is again turning towards what frightens or frustrates us rather than trying to avoid it with unhealthy behaviors that can quickly turn into unhealthy habits that get us into more trouble over the long run. And one way that you can do this is through an exercise called Where Are Your Thoughts that accompanies this video. If you look at the worksheet, what you'll discover is that you're being asked to print it out and keep it with you for an entire day, just noticing and making note of where your brain tends to fall in one of 4 quadrants. Ruminations or grudges from the past carried into the present, over-planning or anxiety about the future carried into the present, heightened emotion, or strategy and solutions. But as you complete the exercise, though, keep in mind that there's no right or wrong answers because mindfulness isn't about trying to manufacture a certain state. The goal is only to hold the question, what is happening right now, at the forefront of your experience and be as objective as possible about what you find there. In other words, you're not a good mindfulness student if you have more marks in the strategic box, or a bad student if you have more marks in the future box, because again, the goal isn't to feel anything. The goal is to get better at feeling everything. And so what we're doing with this exercise is getting you to a place where you can accept whatever is happening without looking at it through the filter of good or bad or right or wrong. Because if you can just get to that place of accepting the present moment without judgment, then what happens next is that you slowly begin to cultivate a healthy relationship with the full scope of emotions, meaning that you develop the ability to savor pleasant experiences with more intensity and move through unpleasant experiences with less intensity because you're not resisting them so severely. And along that line, as you're completing the Where Are Your Thoughts exercise, keep in mind that one of the quickest and most practical ways to strip away judgments and anchor back into presence is by not automatically seeing struggles as problems, but instead simply labeling the experience very objectively. So for example, as you move through different situations and different interactions with people throughout your day, you would simply think anger, or unpleasant, or boredom, or worry, or planning, etc. And so as you're filling out your worksheet, you'll notice that you have the option to just place a check mark in the quadrant that aligns with your thoughts. But you'll get more out of the experience if you use this exercise as a way to practice labeling your thoughts. In fact, researchers have discovered that when you actually take the step of putting your thoughts and feelings into words, you're not only activating the prefrontal cortex of the brain that's responsible for problem solving and decision making, but you're also simultaneously quieting the alarm bells of the amygdala. This is the mental equivalent of hitting the brakes in your car when you see a yellow light, because when you stop being carried by the emotion long enough to name it, you're hitting the emotional brake versus barreling full speed into what could surely become some sort of interpersonal collision if left on its own. And so I want to end this video with one of the most beautiful elements of a mindfulness practice, and it's that through mindfulness we are reminded that as long as we have this moment, we have an opportunity to choose again. This work is not about being perfect. It's about recognizing when you're out of alignment with who you want to be and giving you the tools to bring you back to center, to choose again. And over time, as you get better and better at noticing what's going on in your head, taking a conscious pause and recalibrating, then eventually what you come to realize is that the way you feel is less of a given in the sense that you're just a victim to the dictates of your emotions, and more of a habit. And as you use exercises like Where Are Your Thoughts to build that foundation of strong self-awareness, then the result is what ultimately comes across to others as strong presence. Because at the end of the day, all presence really means is making your inner life safe by knowing that there's no right or wrong way to feel. There is only your choice in this moment. And the more that you can own that choice, then just like Antoinette, the more you can navigate whatever comes your way with grace.